Okay, great. So my name is Aaron Daley. I am the center coordinator at UCSF. I have worked with Parkinson's for about 7 years now. We have actually two large groups at UCSF that see movement disorder patients. Some of you may have seen some of our clinicians.
People ask questions.
We see people at the Parnassus campus. We also see people at the Mount Zion campus, which will be moving to Mission Bay sometime in 2021. We are also a Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence, which means that we have to maintain a certain level of care. We also have to have a certain amount of training and post-training for fellows, as well as our surgeons, things like that. And we actually have been a center of excellence since 1992, which is pretty amazing. There are now, I think, 47 centers around the world. And we were lucky enough to be, I think, within the first 5 or 6 of them. And we've maintained that excellence rating this entire time. So I received a list of questions that it sounds like were called from some of the support group meetings that you had. And I've created a PowerPoint, so I'm going to switch over to that now. And so probably for the bulk of this talk, it's going to be me and my PowerPoint rather than, let's see here. Okay, so can everybody see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah.
Thumbs up if you can see the PowerPoint. All right, thank you, sir. Okay, so as I said, we are a Parkinson's Foundation Center of Excellence, and I think we'll just get into it. So the first 3 questions that were given to me all seem to be addressing similar things. So I wanted to kind of get through those and then try and do more of a general answer. The first one, in the 30+ clinical studies that UCSF is involved, what percentage of these studies are focused on Parkinson's symptom treatment versus studies focused on a cure for Parkinson's, or at least halting the progression of the disease? So it's, you know, this is a correct question in that we do have several avenues of research that we focus on. But the 2 big ones are, you know, how do we help people that have the disease right now to make their lives easier, make their quality of life better? And how do we focus on the long range of stopping this disease in its tracks and keeping it from progressing? What I have found in my research experience is that this really does change. So when we're talking about percentages, it seems like there will be new things that come along that change the focus and change the thrust of some research. And so it really does go back and forth. But I would say, on the whole, it is fairly split down the middle, partially because there are people whose entire careers have been focused on studying the what Parkinson's is. So and then hopefully, if you can figure out what it is, then you can figure out how to halt the progression of it. So I think we need people like that to be doing that type of research, but that doesn't help in the terms of symptom treatment, you know, the here and now. So there always needs to be space for those types of studies as well. So the next question really goes along with that first one, you know, in that, do I have some sort of framework in how I organize these sorts of research studies, the treatment of symptoms versus mitigation or cure? And again, you know, we have a lot of offers for studies that come along, and it's really up to the physicians that I work with to decide which are studies that they think might be good fits for our research groups, or possibly our patients, you know, groups. And, you know, the types of research which were identified here really do a great job of outlining, you know, some of the bigger categories that we look into. So a couple of the things that I'm going to focus on, one being the environmental factors. So this is looking more from an epidemiological point of view. And there's a doctor named Dr. Carly Tanner, who is a neurologist as well as an epidemiologist. And she has spent her entire career actually focusing on these types of questions. And how it is that we see these environmental factors, focused in, why certain areas might be hotspots for Parkinson's disease, that sort of thing. So the other thing that we might also talk about is, from a bench science point of view, is this question of alpha-synuclein, which is a protein that occurs naturally in the body, but we still don't know exactly what it does. But what we do know is that when we do autopsies of people with Parkinson's, we find this clumping of this protein alpha-synuclein. When alpha-synuclein starts to clump together, it forms what we call Lewy bodies. So that's probably a term that most of you have heard. So a Lewy body is really just a clustering of this protein alpha-synuclein. We don't know why, but we do know that we find it when we look at the brains of people with Parkinson's. The other question, as you see here, disruption of cell metabolic processes. So this is looking at the mitochondrial aspects of the cells and why it is that we see these cells dying off early. And then to take that into possibly a treatment aspect is, if we can ensure better health of these cells, can we elongate the time that these neurons are staying alive and therefore are able to function in the brain. So the third question, which I think also had to do sort of with those first two, in the 20 years since Michael J. Fox started his foundation, we still rely on a 50-plus-year-old treatment, carbidopa-levodopa, as the main Parkinson's response, or treatment, I guess. A biomarker for PD while the patient's still alive has not been identified. Compared to the advances made in cancer, multiple sclerosis, and COVID, it feels like we're still in the beginning phases of understanding Parkinson's disease. Other than more research funding, what are the other obstacles that are impeding progress? Could it be that we are defining Parkinson's disease too broadly? I think that's a great question, and I think that it actually answers a bit of itself, because I think that there certainly is a lot to be said for the fact that Parkinson's, as we think of it, is being defined too broadly. So one of the things that I have heard physicians say, I'm not a physician myself, I should hasten to say, is that there's a theory that we are actually dealing with Parkinson's diseases. So this would be that Parkinson's might actually be several different diseases, but we use Parkinson's as a shorthand or an umbrella to cover all of these things. The main reason that we think that that might actually be the case is because their symptomology is differed so completely in how we see the patients and the manifestation of the symptoms. So the fact that we see patients with tremor, and yet there are 30% of people with Parkinson's who never develop a tremor, that there are a whole host of affective disorders, so mood disorders that we see in people with Parkinson's, mostly anxiety and depression, but we also see things like apathy and fatigue. We see people whose lower bodies seem to be much more affected by Parkinson's disease. We see people who get tremors and only have tremor for 20 years and they never really progress beyond that. Some people develop cognitive impairment, some people never develop cognitive impairment. So the real question is, how is it that one disease can be causing this totally different manifestation of symptoms in different people? And so this is what has led physicians to think that this might actually be several different diseases that we are dealing with. The problem therein lies that if we are dealing with several things, then one thing isn't necessarily going to be the sort of key to unlocking the mystery. So just as a reminder as well that, Parkinson's is a movement disorder. It affects about 2% of the population older than 60. The average onset is about 57. And that by 80 years old, about 5% of our general population shows some signs of Parkinsonism. That's different, of course, from Parkinson's disease. So Parkinsonism is the description of the symptoms that we see in people with Parkinson's, such as a slowness, stiffness, possibly a tremor. So genetic Parkinson's is relatively low. It only accounts for about 10% of the population, and that most cases are idiopathic, so they're of an unknown origin. When we start to talk about environmental factors, there is a theory that say that it is both nature and nurture, that genetics loads the gun and then the environment pulls the trigger. The thought being that some people might have a genetic susceptibility to Parkinson's. And then if they are exposed to a certain set of environmental factors, that might actually trigger the disease. So again, this is a hypothesis, but it goes in answering, why it is so difficult, because if every person's genetics are different and every person has a different response maybe to an environmental trigger, how is it that we then can drill down into something more useful as far as treatment and or stopping the progression? So one of the bigger questions in the last couple of years has been the relation of Parkinson's disease and the gut. So I wanted to just cover that very quickly because I think it is a very interesting hypothesis. It is known as Brachs Hypothesis. And the general thought is that Parkinson's is a pathogen that enters either through the nasal cavity or through the mouth into the gut, and then starts to travel up the vagus nerve to the brain. So we know that Parkinson's disease, where we see the general dysfunction or the main dysfunction of neurons, is in this area of the brain called the substantia nigra, which means the black substance. This is an area of the brain that's involved in movement. However, as you can see in this diagram here, you can see that the vagus nerve is connected to several very important organs in the body. And what we see in Parkinson's disease is it isn't just a movement disorder. There are so many other components and symptoms that we can find in people that this is a very nice hypothesis in explaining why it is that we see all of these sorts of different symptoms. Because we do see things like a dysregulation in heart rate at times, things like constipation, things like urinary frequency and urgency. All of these things can be somewhat explained if we think about a pathogen that is traveling up through this nerve, as well as the fact that the first area that it enters is into the brain stem, which controls all of these autonomic functions that we don't think about, but that we certainly do see in people with Parkinson's. So again, dysfunctions of regulation of heart rate, the fact that people can be constipated or have constipation issues 10 years before any sort of motor symptoms show up. The problem with this hypothesis is that there are definitely plenty of people with Parkinson's who don't fit into this diagram, whose symptoms and explanations don't necessarily fit in with the progression that one would see if something was traveling up through the vagus nerve. But that is sort of a short, concise version of the gut theory that has been part of a dialogue in Parkinson's lately. So an update on new drugs or therapies available. It sounds like you've had at least a talk on one of these recently. What I wanted to address as well in one of the other questions is, why is it that we are still using a 50-plus-year-old treatment in carbidopa levodopa, or levodopa specifically? Part of that is because I think what we are looking to do, it's replacing dopamine, and for the time being, until we find a definite cure, the best thing we can do is really replace the dopamine that's being lost through the neuron loss. Now, most of the latest drugs that I have heard of seem to be addressing off times and how to lessen the off times that people are having. So this is when a person's medications are not working for them. And it obviously can be a very frustrating thing when you've had a good response to a medication and then you start to have longer and longer times where the medication is not working. So it sounds like you have had at least a presentation on Ambrosia, an inhalable form of levodopa. Again, these are all adjunct therapies. So these are all added to someone who is already taking a dose of carbidopa, levodopa at regular intervals. What they are doing is sort of either bridging the gaps between doses or looking to elongate the effectiveness of the drug, carbidopa, levodopa, that's being taken already. And these other two, really in the last year to 2 years, have come onto the market, and they both are doing sort of the same thing. The second one here, Ongentys, is a different version of Comten or entacapone, which many people might already be taking. And the real thrust of any of these medications is just to make the carbidopa, levodopa more effective for the person, particularly if they have started to find that the effectiveness is wearing off and they're not getting a full sort of satisfactory response. So those are mostly the drug therapies that I have heard of lately that are coming on. There are things being looked at in research as well, having to do with things like gene therapy, which is in the early stages, but I'm involved in a gene therapy trial at UCSF right now, which I think is very interesting. You know, it's there are a lot of different versions of gene therapy that are being tried right now. Most of them looking to either provide a neuroprotective aspect to the area of the brain that we see a lot of the dysfunction in, or trying to help regulate the response of people who are taking carbidopa, levodopa to have a more natural or normal response to the medications. The gene therapy itself, which I won't focus too much time on, but is using basically an inert virus, and they are inserting a genetic code into it that then is put into the area of the brain, so that they can use the brain itself to actually develop a better response or bring back a response that may have been lost. So UCSF providing Parkinson's community. So we do actually have two websites. There has been a shuffle in the last year as far as divisions within UCSF, and the hope is that we're actually going to have one sort of overarching website that will support a lot of these things. However, there is good information on both of these sites, which I'm happy to share with Rick afterwards. I can send a follow-up email that has these links. But we do have things like videos from past conferences, which hopefully some of you were able to attend back when we used to have an annual conference. Links to online exercises. You know, I think that having, from what I understand, Rocksteady Boxing has started doing some remote classes, support groups as well. While I hasten to advertise for a rival group, I know that the Stanford Parkinson Center actually does keep a really great list of support groups with contact information for basically all of Northern California. And I think that if ever one is interested, that's a really good resource as well. So along with that, I will say that one of my coworkers at UCSF has actually just started a new support group for newly diagnosed people. So if anybody who is in attendance is interested in attending a group that is specific for people who are newly diagnosed, I can send out the contact information to Rick for that as well. Along with Samuel Yee, who is a social worker at UCSF, it's also being co-run by Susan Heath, who worked, I believe, for 20 plus years at the VA in San Francisco, coordinating all of their support group, as well as a lot of the DBS surgeries that occurred out there. So she has a wealth of experience and a wealth of knowledge. So anyone that is interested, I will send out this contact information as well as the flyer. But that is something very new that UCSF is just starting. So some of the questions here are pretty subjective. So is caregiving for PD any different than caregiving for any other significant health issue? I wouldn't say so, other than the fact that, as we all know, Parkinson's, has so many different symptom manifestations that there may be differing aspects, as related to maybe someone who had, a chronic lung issue where it's very specific as to the things the person is being limited by. I think caregiving is caregiving. It really is more about making sure that the quality of life and the person is safe and taken care of, and that danger is headed off before it becomes a problem, as related to falls, as related to general safety, as related to socialization and things like that. But I think that anyone who is caregiving for any person with a significant health issue, the core tenets are fairly the same. Which leads into a real landmine of a question. Do women deal with PD better than men? And if so, why? I wouldn't have the first clue as to how to answer that, other than to say, it seems that more men seem to have Parkinson's than women. It's not, it's not too much of a spread. It's more like I've heard somewhere in the neighborhood of like a 55% men to 45% women. I would say, as a way of avoiding getting into any sort of arguments here, that I think men and women deal with everything in different ways. And that probably could apply as well to things like chronic health issues, certainly for themselves or for a person that they may be caregiving for. The table for six concept is based on the thought that people open up more in small groups. Is this valid? So I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that we as people probably feel a lot safer talking to a few people rather than a giant group, especially when we are talking about things that may be embarrassing, that may be hard to discuss. So I think that, any support group probably could be helped possibly by combining these two sorts of concepts, having a space where a few people or small groups can get together and discuss things, and maybe then come together into a larger group to be able to talk about more, broad concepts. But I think it probably is true that people do open up more in smaller groups. I think that all you have to do is look at any person who has a very close friend who they are able to tell anything to, and then say, well, would you feel comfortable, telling 10 of your friends that same thing? And probably most people would say no. But if it's just one person, there probably is just a development of intimacy that is higher, and people probably feel safer opening up more. It appears that 6 months of COVID has drastically impacted morale of the PNMD members. Is it harder to get people to help? Does Aaron agree? And what can be done to overcome? Yeah, I'd say the first real bummer of this question is that it's been more than 6 months of COVID now. We're unfortunately into month 9 now. And I think that morale of the entire country, the entire world, has really been drastically impacted. I see it in a lot of the support groups that I work with, that there really is a fatigue that has set in. I think that also people are really hurting for human interaction and contact. And I think that none of us quite understood how much we relied on that until we weren't able to have it as much. I think Zoom has been great for being able to keep a lifeline open for people. I think that it has been great as far as allowing people who may have had trouble leaving a house in order to attend an in-person support group to still be able to have an interaction. But I think that Zoom is a poor excuse for real in-person human interaction. And I think that we are all feeling that. You know, how much did we realize how much we took for granted being able to hug a friend before they left, much less see a friend now. And I think that those sorts of things really have impacted, you know, the emotional, you know, components of all of us. I mean, regardless of whether we are in a Parkinson's group or whether we are just, you know, not able to see family members, you know, I think it also does impact the way that we can help people who have crises going on. You know, 90%, excuse me, 90% of the people that we see in clinic now is done over Zoom. And we are able to evaluate in a general aspect, you know, the health of people, the progression of their diseases, things like that. But there really is a component that is lost, that is not there in doing telehealth. It's also harder to connect people because of restrictions as far as having people do physical therapy. You know, there is a capacity that you cannot exceed anymore for people that actually go in to receive physical therapy. It is being done, but it's being done at a severely lowered percentage. What also then you focus on is, you know, physical therapists are really wary of doing Zoom calls to do physical therapy with a patient because there is no way for them to help or save the person if for some reason they lost their balance in the midst of a training exercise. And that really then enters into what physical therapists may be able to do if the very thing that they want to work on with the person is not being able to be done safely. You know, they can discuss exercises, but at the same time, you don't really want to start suggesting things that a person might try to do on their own and end up injuring themselves. So I think that it is harder to get help to people who need it. My hope is that in the next 6 months that we can start to see a turnaround with that. But that really, I think, relies on how we all respond to the next 6 months. Are we able to get the spread under control? Is the vaccine going to be effective? Are people going to get the vaccine at levels that we need to in order to start developing that type of immunity? Does a PD sufferer's family typically contribute, or is it more you are on your own? So this question made me pretty sad, I have to say. I would hope that anyone's family would help or contribute if a person had been diagnosed with some sort of chronic illness. I certainly would be interested if anyone felt like they had been told that they were on their own from their family members. I hope that they would be able to reach out either to myself or to a friend or a doctor, someone like that, and just let them know that they are not being supported, because certainly there are alternatives or things that can be done to help someone. But my hope would be that you know, a family would be able to help in any way that they can for a person with Parkinson's. That does lead into the question again, though, as far as COVID is concerned, you know, because I know that there's a lot of frustration with family members who, you know, aren't maybe living near a family member with Parkinson's and they're not able to see them on a regular basis. And it really does severely impact how they might be able to help that person. But if anyone is in that particular situation, I would ask you to reach out to me just to see if there's any way that you can be helped. Those in the mental health field seem to have little knowledge of Parkinson's disease. Why is this? I think this is a great question, because I think you could take out mental health field and really apply pretty much a lot of different health fields to this question. I think that there's an assumption that doctors and nurses and physical therapists and occupational therapists and all those people know everything about every disease, and including Parkinson's. And unfortunately, it's not the case. It's part of why we insist that whenever possible, a person with Parkinson's should be seen by a movement disorder specialist, because these are people with specific training on movement disorders, including Parkinson's. And they are going to know more about the treatments. They're going to know more about the changing of symptoms. They're going to know more about the progression. They're just going to know more about all the questions that a person might have. And especially with something like Parkinson's, where every person, their manifestation of symptoms is different. And when we talk specifically about mental health, I think it's one of the biggest problems that we in the health field have is trying to find therapists, trying to find psychiatrists, trying to find psychologists who understand the kinds of things that people with Parkinson's deal with. So we know that depression and anxiety are rampant in people with Parkinson's. We know that there's this aspect of apathy, which is separate from the depression. We know that we can treat the depression and the apathy remains, but we don't know why. And that's for people who work in the field with Parkinson's. So then to have a person, who is a mental health professional but doesn't understand those sorts of things, I think can be really, really frustrating. So I think that there is this assumption that you go into the emergency room, why doesn't the doctor know anything about your Parkinson's medications? And it really is because that is not their training, that it is a very specific kind of training that goes into knowing about movement disorders. Sort of the underlying question of that too is, how do we start to train mental health professionals to know more about that? How do we have access to more of mental health professionals? I know that we scour the Bay Area trying to find private therapists or therapists that take insurance, take Medicare, things like that. And we really, it's unfortunately a real drought out there. I think that this is the sort of thing that can be very good with a support group, is if someone does find someone who does know about Parkinson's, who is willing to see new patients, that kind of information can be disseminated amongst the group. But I know I can say that it's a real source of frustration for us. The Parkinson's Foundation also does keep track of people who have Parkinson's experience. And calling the hotline for the Parkinson's Foundation, which I can send that information as well, might be a good source just to start out if somebody does feel that they need to talk with someone and want to have someone who has some knowledge of Parkinson's. I think that one of the other things that we really focus on when we're talking about physical therapy is that there are physical therapists who are actually trained in neurological conditions. So whenever you do get physical therapy, it's important to try and find someone who has what they call an NCS certification. So that's a neuro clinical specialist. And this is someone who's just going to understand more of the specific issues that someone with Parkinson's is going to face. So talking a bit about just general symptom management. So managing the fatigue of PD. This is unfortunately another source of real frustration, because there are people with Parkinson's who fatigue is the primary symptom. Their motor symptoms are relatively mild. However, the fatigue is just something that goes on and on and on. And we don't have a good treatment for it. It doesn't seem to respond to carbidopa-levodopa. There was a time, several decades ago, where they actually experimented with giving amphetamines to people who were suffering from this fatigue. But obviously, we now know that amphetamines is not the kind of thing that you want to give anybody on a regular basis. But managing the fatigue really, trying to mitigate all the other issues that might be contributing to fatigue would probably be the best thing that I could suggest. So sleep hygiene, making sure that, that there aren't things like electronics, TV, iPads, phones in the bedroom, making sure that you're not looking at those sorts of things right before bed. The blue light that is given off by all of these screens really scrambles the brain as far as your sleep cycles are concerned. That's not laying in bed if you're not able to fall asleep, but getting up, moving to another room, sitting in a low light, reading something boring, that is printed material rather than on some sort of iPad, and then trying again in about 15 minutes. So sleep hygiene in particular, hopefully could be something, but if we're talking about sort of Parkinson's disease related fatigue, there unfortunately aren't many options as far as treatment.
Hi, Aaron. It's
So
12:40.
yeah,
This is just a time check for you.
thank you. Okay, great. So when to start using a walker? Do you have to fall first? No, the hope would be that, an assistive aid is brought into the picture before the fall. This decision, I think, is something that should come from the patient, the patient's family, or the caregiver, as well as the treating neurologist. The assistive aid, we don't want people to start using canes and walkers before they really need to, because we want to encourage independence with people with Parkinson's. Now, at the same time, we also want to have, safety concerns addressed before they become problems. So if you are starting to feel as though your balance is off to the point that falling becomes more and more of a risk, it's a good question to bring up to your neurologist and say, is this the time that I need to start thinking about a walker? Or do I maybe use a walker, but only in certain circumstances when I am feeling more unsteady? The issue with the walker is that the more you rely on it, the more you need it, and the less independent that you're going to be, and the less your body is going to remain independent. It will start to need the walker in order to move. But obviously, we don't want you to fall first. So if imbalance and balance issues are starting to become a problem, then it's a perfectly acceptable thing to bring up to the neurologist and say, I just want to know what is the general map if I started to think that I might need something like a walker. So the difference between palliative care for chronic illness and that for terminal conditions. So this is an ongoing battle that we have to discern palliative care from hospice care. So hospice care is defined as care for people who have terminal conditions, so they have 6 months less to live. Palliative care is much more about creating support and encouraging the highest quality of life amongst people who may have a chronic illness. So they have started to use a term called supportive care rather than palliative care recently. And that really does speak more to what the aim, hopefully, of palliative care is. So it's bringing in things like social workers. It's bringing in things like physical therapists and having them be a part of the conversation earlier on and not waiting for a specific issue to crop up, which then necessitates a referral to someone. So it is another way of palliative care would be something like multidisciplinary care, where you are bringing in lots of different types of discipline to try and address issues related to quality of life. There is usually a spiritual component as well. So for something like Parkinson's disease, in which we actually do have a palliative care clinic at UCSF, what you have is a movement disorder specialist. You have usually a nurse trained in Parkinson's. You may have a pharmacist who is there to talk about specific drugs and the use of drugs, the changing of drugs. a physical therapist, a chaplain of some sort, and a social worker. And the thing is that you don't have to have all of these things all at the same time, but it's good to have a conversation with each of these things, even if it's a conversation of, do we want to check in and see if there's anything that you needed from us? No, great. Okay, we'll talk again in 6 months. But it's giving that option, that if there is a need, that it can be addressed. It can be addressed early. Social work is probably one of the bigger components of that sort of palliative care model. For people early on, it may be things like, do you have an advance directive in place? Does your spouse have an advance directive in place? Does your caregiver have a health condition that we might need to check in on to make sure at some point, that they're not going to be able to provide all the caregiving? Do you need referrals to possibly outside caregiving source? So it's starting that conversation. And again, not necessarily that you're going to need all aspects of it right away, but that the options are there and that the conversation has been started already. So that would probably be how I would define palliative care, or the model that we hope for in people with Parkinson's, as opposed to hospice care, which again is for people with terminal conditions where the expectation is that they will have 6 months or less to live. And that is really just addressing the immediate components as far as comfort, as well as are things in place when the person expires.
Aaron, this is Rick
Yes, sir.
Stevens here. We have 15 minutes left. Do you want to hold off on this and see if we have any audience questions in the last 15 minutes?
Yeah, of course.
And then it seems to me we could easily do this over 2 hours. It's such a rich source of questions and answers and things to know. It's fabulous.
Yes, I mean, I would certainly say that, I am happy to do a repeat of this, and I love the questions that people are coming. I think that they are great, and the hope that, I've been giving talks with the PNMD for several years now, and I hope only to enrich and deepen the relationship that we have. So as long as you want to hear me talk, I am happy to keep talking at future dates.
Excellent. Let's open it up to some questions from the audience. Because there are 45 people here, I'd like you to raise your hand, as in so, and I will simply go across the screen, ask you to unmute and ask your question. So those of you who have questions, raise your hands if you would, and I'll start to call on people. Faye Strauss, why don't you unmute yourself, Faye, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you for speaking with us today. I was wondering if UCSF is doing research on focused ultrasound, particularly for tremors that aren't responsive to medication.
Mm-hmm. I get a lot of questions about focused ultrasounds. To my knowledge, we are not. I think Stanford at some point was doing some research on it. I don't know that that continues still, but as far as I know, we are not at UCSF doing focused ultrasound.
Thank you.
All right, any other question? How about Sandy Stamatis? I'm gonna unmute you. Okay, Sandy, you can ask your question.
Very, very nice, interesting topics that you covered today.
Thank you.
But my question is, I've been diagnosed 21 years, and I'm still taking the same carbidopa, leva, and cinnamon. Or well, I'm getting confused here. Stalevo, with that.
Stalevo, yeah.
There's been nothing done for 21 years to advance anything or your patient. And it's always see in 6 months. When you go to the neurologist, they sit down and say, tap your fingers, touch your nose, see in 6 months. And it's very frustrating because for the last 19 years, I've been fine. no tremors, nobody would know I had it. In the last 6 months, I can't hardly walk and I'm freezing all the time. Then again, I go in to my neurologist and she says, "You were just here." And I say, "Well, this just came up." And she says, "Can tap your nose, tap your fingers." And then
Okay.
off I go.
Have you ever heard of lion's mane mushrooms as a treatment for Parkinson's?
So what can we do, or where can we go to try to get some kind of help? It's just like we're lost. And that's not,
Mhm. So the question is that things were stable for the first 19 years, but they've now changed, and it sounds like they've changed drastically. Is that right?
That's correct.
See,
Okay.
see,
Um,
there you
I
go.
have a chat question for you, Aaron, which is, have you
Oh,
ever
okay.
heard of lion's mane mushrooms as a treatment for Parkinson's?
okay. Is that from the same person? I don't want to skip that
No.
question
No.
first.
No, that's
Okay.
a different question, a different person.
No, I understand your frustration. It's something that we certainly hear a lot in, again, why are we using a drug that was used, or that came out 50 plus years ago? Why is that still the best treatment? And I don't know the answer other than, time and time again, it really has proven to be the most effective. And it's not for lack of trying. That dopamine agonists for a while were a big thing. But then the side effects of those really started to show that they weren't really as effective or as useful as we thought they might be. The problem with predicting progression in Parkinson's is it really is a mystery as well. The expectation is, always, well, let's look what the past looked like, and that might be a way of predicting the future. But unfortunately, no one has a crystal ball. And with someone who's had it for 20 years and it has stayed fairly stable, the expectation would be that it would probably continue to be along the same course. Having a drastic change, the question would be, is there some other health issue that might be impacting or causing that? We certainly see a lot of people whose Parkinson's symptoms suddenly get a little worse. And it isn't that the Parkinson's got worse, it's that they have some other underlying infection that has started to put stress on their bodies. So I would counsel something like that, of just seeing a general practitioner, making sure that there is some other issue at play that might be affecting that. We tell people a lot of times, who may see their symptoms get worse and want to increase their medications, things like that, to really make sure that, because we don't usually see this sort of drop off the cliff with Parkinson's in symptoms.
Okay.
It does tend to be a gradual change.
Well, thank you very much.
But that would probably be my suggestion. So I'm sorry, Rick, the question was about mushrooms?
Have you ever heard of lion's mane mushrooms as a treatment for Parkinson's?
I have not. I have never heard of lion's mane mushrooms.
Okay, let's then skip that. And who else wants to raise their hand and ask a question? Mary Barrett. Mary, you have to unmute yourself.
Yep. So we had a support group meeting this morning and a question came up. We talked a little bit about the COVID vaccine and whether people were going to or plan on taking that, those with Parkinson's. And the question came up is that, has there any research been done on the effect of the vaccine on COVID, on Parkinson's folks? And also, will UCSF consider a study on how the COVID vaccine affects those with Parkinson's?
I have not heard anything specifically. The only thing that I have been involved in conversation-wise is related to the gene therapy studies that we're involved with. And that mostly is just that we want to make sure that there is some sort of gap between the surgical infusion of the gene therapy and any sort of vaccine. So The same with the flu vaccine as well as COVID vaccine, that we just want to make sure that there's at least some substantial amount of time between those two actions. And that mostly is just so that if there are any problems, that we are able to discern what is likely the cause of it, be it the infusion or the vaccine. But I have not heard any special circumstances or special warnings as related to Parkinson's. My assumption, given the newness and the novelty of both the disease as well as the vaccine, is that there are probably going to be research studies focused on every chronic illness and how it reacts to the COVID vaccine. I would hope, at least, because we need all the information that we can get going forward, and especially as we get newer vaccines, that there may be 5 different vaccines, and the question is, are people going to respond to these differently if they have different chronic underlying illnesses? So my hope would be that there is going to be future research on that, but it's nothing that I've heard of.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, next, Walter, if you will unmute yourself there. Can you unmute yourself, Walter?
There you go. Aaron, have you heard of a supplement to Cinemet called Mucuna Prurin?
I don't think so.
That's spelled M-U-C-U-N-A, Prurin.
I feel like that is the bean that has naturally occurring dopamine in it.
That's correct.
The velvet bean, right?
Right.
So I have heard of that for people who want to have sort of a natural based version of levodopa therapy. So I've heard of people using it. I think that the argument I have heard the physicians I work with, is, do you want to eat bowl after bowl of beans versus take one small pill that provides the same level of dopamine replacement? But I have heard of it. There certainly are people that we see who take it either adjunct. I think the most important thing is, if you are taking it, to make sure that you're telling your neurologist about it, just because it could possibly change the levels of doses that a physician might prescribe to you. And or if you start to have some sort of side effects, to make sure that they know that you are taking that supplement. As well as just that, supplements aren't regulated by the FDA. So there can be a real question as to the change in, and how much of a dose you're taking.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. We're closing in toward the end of the presentation. So is there somebody who has a question they would like to ask? Raise your hand. Dennis Slaughter.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm kind of interested in what we know about the causes of PD. I think of, you mentioned there's a possible genetic predisposition, but it sounds like that has to be triggered by something. And even without that predisposition, I think of, like myself, I've been exposed to ionizing radiation, to lead, to beryllium, to phosgene gas. I was wondering, what do we know about whether any of these things are causative?
Yeah, so there, when people come in and they are first looking for a diagnosis, most movement disorder specialists, they will go over some of the secondary causes that one might find as far as exposures are concerned with Parkinson's. So things like traumatic brain injuries. So the question, concerning Muhammad Ali, was his Parkinson's actually based in idiopathic Parkinson's disease, or was it a result of repeated blows to the head? There are people who have who suffer either encephalitis or meningitis, who may later in life actually develop certain symptoms of Parkinson's as well. So what most doctors are trying to do when they're asking those sorts of questions is, is there actually some sort of secondary cause for Parkinson's that may not be what we traditionally think of as sort of the idiopathic version of Parkinson's, which we still don't have good explanation as to what that is. But there are things like firefighters who are exposed to a multitude of toxic gases, as well as other things, who may have an increased exposure and also an increased possible Parkinson's disease diagnosis. So there is, it seems, a certain component of the environment and exposure which really adds into this, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be this one-to-one ratio of, if you are exposed to X, then you develop Y. I think that it would probably be much more satisfying if we were able to do that, because then we really start to mitigate, these sorts of exposures much more. I think it's in the same that people with Parkinson's a lot of the times look for some sort of genesis of the disease. It usually has to do with some sort of traumatic incident. Like, I got into a car accident, and after that, I started to notice that my shoulder and my arm were stiff, or that the tremor came out. What it most likely is that your body was compensating for the Parkinson's disease and really quelling those sorts of symptom responses. And then there was some traumatic incident that allowed your body to focus on another aspect that was injured, and it had left to focus on quelling and mitigating those sorts of things like a tremor. But what people see is, I got into a car accident, and after that, I had Parkinson's disease. But really, the Parkinson's was probably there all along, but it took distracting your body and your brain to really have it start to be brought to the forefront.
Okay, thank you very much. Folks, this brings us to the end, or the conclusion part of our Lunch and Learn. So first of all, I want to thank Aaron Daley from UCSF. And I also want to thank the 45 people who joined us today, which is a really nice, it's been a great group as far as I can tell. And one of the questions that had come up was about COVID and how that interacts with Parkinson's and its treatment. So I wanted to let people know that on January 13th, we have another Lunch and Learn with Dr. Racine Belcora on living with Parkinson's in the time of COVID. It'll be another one in which you can submit questions or ask live online.